Philadelphia is steep in broadcast history. From the early pioneering days of broadcasting in the 1920s to today, Philadelphia has always been at the forefront. The Delaware Valley has been home to some of the best local programming in the country, starting with the early soap operas and children's shows to pioneering the best news formats in the country. Much of it all began right here. From radio announcers to television personalities, cameramen to directors, these were the broadcasters that burned up the airwaves. These were the pioneers of Philadelphia broadcasting.
Hello and welcome once again to Philadelphia Pioneers of Broadcasting. This time we're coming to you from the studios of More FM 101.1. You may recall it started as WDVR, and then it became WEAZ, Easy 101, and then it became WBEB 101. That became Busy B 101, and now we are at More FM, and we're going to get an explanation of all those changes. Our guests today are the two men behind this very, very successful station, and it is the most successful station in the whole country. The founder, or one of the founders, is Jerry Lee, who is the owner of this station and responsible for the direction it's taken over the last, I hate to say this, 50 years. I know that because normally I'm a disinterested party in these discussions, but this time around I actually worked for these people at the very beginning of the station. I wish I perhaps should have stayed here. Anyway, and also with us is Blaise Howard, who is the general manager and has been for what, the last 20 years or so?
17.
Let's start, Jerry. How did this come about? It's May of 1963. A fellow by the name of David Kurtz, who I remember was a Philco engineer, physically puts the station on the air. He kind of builds the station himself. Tell us that story.
Well, Dave had this vision of having a radio station, and he lived like a pauper for, I don't know, maybe 10 years in order to save enough money to put the station on the air. And his total invested capital was $28,500. We had enough to operate for about 6 weeks, and then we're out of business. And so at any rate, I heard that he got his license. I had met him about a year before that when I was trying to sell a programming service to him. And he was the only one that had a legitimate reason for not buying the service because he didn't have his license yet. Everybody else just turned me down. Uh-huh. And a guy that owned a station in Baltimore figured, well, I could get the programming service for nothing if I hired this guy, so he hired me. I worked there for a year and a half, and then I heard in Broadcasting Magazine that Dave got his license. So I pick up the phone and call Dave, and I said, Dave, remember me? I saw you a year ago. No, I don't remember you. I said, oh, okay. I says, I'd like to have lunch with you. So I came in from Baltimore, had lunch with him. And after about an hour and a half, he said, I got to get back to my job at Philco. I said, well, Dave, I'm only in town for the day. We have dinner together. So he agreed to have dinner. At 7 o'clock at night we met, and by 10 o'clock that night, we had signed a contract on the back of a napkin. And the contract said, it was a 3-year contract, that said he could fire me at the end of the first 12 months if we weren't the #1 FM station in Philadelphia. And he's an engineer. I figured I had to do something that was outrageous to get him to agree to something. That's why I said, I'll be the #1 FM in the market. If we're not, you can fire me. So I took away the risk. Well, within 4.5 months, we were the #1 FM station in the market.
I think what's interesting, and people, younger people may not realize this because FM dominates radio today. That was not the case back in the early 60s. All of the stations were AM stations in the top stations in Philadelphia or anywhere in the country. Wasn't that the case?
Oh, absolutely. FM was considered worthless. In fact, you just went to the FCC, knocked on the door and said, give me one of those licenses.
Yeah.
Because nobody had figured out a way to make a profit. We were the first profitable FM station in the country.
And I will join you and tell my stories as well. But I came aboard in November of 1963, and I remember by the time I got there, which would have been 6 months later,
Yeah, right.
you were the number one. You must have been the number one FM station because you were the number one, the first FM station to ever crack the top 10 in Philadelphia at that
Yeah.
point. Everybody else was an AM station.
Right.
Okay, we'll come back, but I want to go over to Blaise for a second and just talk in terms of the format, because I referred to it when I was working. Here is elevator music. I think you called it beautiful music.
Absolutely.
Okay, and over the years, those formats have changed, and yet the station is still very, very successful. How do you determine what kind of music to play? It's obviously not rock and roll. It's not hip hop. It's not classic. What is it?
I really the credit goes to Jerry and his belief in research, and this station is the most highly researched station in the country. Even before I joined the company in 1997, Jerry did more research than any of the major radio groups did. In a year, he did more, and we continue to do that. And really, what we do is listen to our listeners. They tell us where to go. They tell us what to do and what they want. And one of the things about research is being able to interpret it correctly. And Jerry is probably one of the few that has an ability to, over a period of time, seeing this research, understand it and make correct decisions and where the radio station would go. So he was able to see, long before I joined the company, that the beautiful music was on its way out 3 years before it was on its last leg. And he made that decision, and people thought he was nuts when he went from beautiful music to adult contemporary music, when it went to Easy 101 or Easy 101.
And each of those changes, by the way, when the call letters changed, it indicated a change in format and of the kind of music you were playing.
Well, I think that after it got to Easy 101, I think it wasn't so much a change in format, but an evolution of music and musical taste. It was still an adult contemporary format,
right,
but musical taste changed. New artists came there, and as we like to say, we like to program to a 40-year-old woman. All right? And every year it's the same, and people pass through that, and we've programmed there. And as they pass through, what are their likes, their dislikes? And we kind of follow that from that perspective. We don't paint the station pink, but we take a look at what she wants and what she likes, and we deliver that music.
And it's
we
worked,
research it.
clearly.
We do music research, we do perceptual research, and as I said, it's really nice when you have somebody with Jerry's background and being able to take a look at the research and interpret it correctly so we can make correct decisions and move forward with the radio station.
Yeah. Let's go back then to '63, and you've already come up with this format, this idea. And where did that come from? How did you come up with that idea?
Well, I couldn't afford to go to college, so I had to join the Korean War. With my luck, the war just ended, but they still had the GI Bill. And I was able to get enough money out of the GI Bill to be able to go to college. But it was tough because it really wasn't enough money to comfortably go through college. And so I decided that I would start running record hops. I was one of the early pioneers in record hops.
Oh.
And I didn't actually do it myself. I organized them and hired people. And
Where was that, by the way? It's not.
this was in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, Sharon, then Cleveland. And at any rate, what happened, when I got out of college, I decided that I was going to go straight, not be a rock and roll promoter the rest of my life. So I became a management consultant. And I hated the job. After being on the peripheral of showbiz, management consulting was very, very boring. But here's when I have tremendous luck. So one day, about a year and a half into the job, I have to make a decision I have a 1 o'clock appointment, and the only restaurant I can go to is a Greek restaurant, and I come from a family where salt and pepper was spices. And I still to this day can remember vividly agonizing at 11:30 in the morning, should I go without lunch or go into this Greek restaurant? Finally, I said, oh, okay, I got to eat lunch. It changed my life. I walk into this restaurant, and now this kid that worked for me when he was 15 is now 19, And he says, remember that girl that I brought to the dance with me? I married her. Father had money, and he backed me putting an FM station on the air in a suburb of Akron. And he developed the first programming service in history of radio.
Ah.
And on the spot at this Greek restaurant, standing in the waiting area, he offered me the job of selling his programming service. The next day, I quit my job, went to work for him for 9 weeks, did not make a single sale, and he fired me. Now here I am, just recently married, about a year and a half ago. I had a new baby, and I have no money, and I'm out of a job.
Wow.
But 5 people offered me jobs running their station because they knew that I knew the formula. So, as I said earlier, this guy that owned a station in Baltimore hired me to run a station. And that's how I got into the business, and that's where I got the format from. And the format was very simple. Play all familiar music. When I came into Philadelphia in '63, there were 4 competitors, and every competitor was playing 7 out of 10 familiar songs. Play obscure Broadway show tunes, etc. We played nothing but familiar music, and that's why we went to the top just like that.
All mostly instrumental.
Yeah, 1 out of 4 was vocal.
Yeah. Well, then let me back up and join the conversation and tell you. So I come to work in, I'll always remember the date, and I'll tell you why, or you'll see why in a moment, on November 21st, 1963. And when you talk about your format, and I'll get into that date in a moment, but you talk about your format, I remember we played records. There were no CDs or anything like that. We were playing records. And on the back of every album was a list of whether the tune was fast, slow, medium, fast. And there was a format that you had created.
Right.
Does that still exist, by the way? Is it still?
No, we don't do it that way.
Okay. And
Much
you
more
had to,
sophisticated.
so there was a list, and if you were supposed to play a fast tune and you picked up this record, you played the next fast tune and you made a check mark next to it. And if there was no fast tune on that one, you skipped that album, because that was just as important as the song itself. And it was down to that kind of detail, which is just, I think, remarkable, and that's what you credit.
Incidentally, I have to also give credit to Marlon Taylor.
Oh.
He was a superb program director.
Yeah, Marlon Taylor was.
Yeah, he was really a good guy.
Yeah. Let me, a complete aside on this, by the way. As you point out, there was no money. So there was no wire machine. There was no, but we did newscasts every 3 hours. You remember the story. You're laughing about it. So
I totally forgot about it.
It's November 21st, and I'm still a student at Temple University, and I get hired, but I'm not supposed to actually do one of those newscasts for some time. The following morning, I'm with a friend of mine. We hear on the radio the president's been shot. It was the day Kennedy was assassinated. I was still at Temple, so I went back to the university, and used to work at WRTI, the Temple radio station. They had a wire machine. They had money. And so I started taking this copy off of the machine. I wish I still had it. And I then went home and came in on my shift at WDVR. I wasn't scheduled to go on the air, but it was my copy. It's like it's my basketball. And so I got to read the copy. And that's when I went on the air for the very first time.
What a story.
On November 22nd.
That's very
that was the beginning. And then the other story, and then I'll get back to you guys, because I love this story, is we did newscasts every 3 hours, as you remember, but there was no wire machine. And the way we did the newscasts was we listened to WIP, which at the time was a middle-of-the-road radio station, not music, not sports, and they had a terrific news department. And so we would copy down whatever they did, and then every 3 hours we would provide this plagiarized newscast. But even then, it was a very, very successful station. With the plagiarized news, and your format overcame the plagiarized news.
That's a new slug line. Plagiarized news, live at 4.
give us 3 hours and we'll give you the plagiarized news. Okay. At this point, the station is, as you say, the most popular independent station, by the way. Every other station, and that's worth a conversation, by the way, is owned by some corporation that owns 5 other stations, perhaps here in Philadelphia. How have you managed to, and either one of you can take this, managed to stay independent, not sold out to somebody?
Well,
It's interesting. I joined Jerry hired me in 1997, and this was about a year after the deregulation
Right.
in 1996, where companies could go out and buy up radio, TV. It was deregulated. I guess there were ownership limits to a certain degree. And when I was interviewing with Jerry, I said, well, what are your plans for the future about any acquisitions or whatever? And he says, well, I don't have any. He said, I have two things I want to do. He says, I'm not going to buy any other radio stations. And because of the deregulations, I think we have an excellent opportunity to get bigger and become the biggest radio station in the marketplace, because they're going to be worried about consolidation, finding areas to save money, and we're going to go out and go on the aggressive. And we're going to go out and we're going to market, we're going to do more research, we're going to do more testing. And boy, was he right. He was absolutely right. And I got here in 97. By 2000, we were way above everybody else in the marketplace, and it was it just, for the next 10 years, it was unbelievable. And today we're still number one in the market. We're still the most listened to radio station in the market.
Yeah. Are you ever tempted to say, I'm going to buy a station in New York or buy a station in LA and do the same thing over again?
I'll tell you, there's a very good reason for that, and that is there's more to life than just owning a radio station. I have this passion for criminology, and I got into it by accident, but once I got into it, I saw there was a tremendous upside that I could achieve doing good for the world. And I figured if I'm out trying to buy other stations, I won't be able to do that. And so I'm very involved in the field of education. President Bush named me one of 13 people responsible for all federal research dollars in education. I had a $600 million budget doing great research. Everything I do is based on research. I'm a research fanatic.
And that's interesting. Well, let's break away from radio for a second. Talk about the criminology. What was the attraction? What are you doing there? What's that?
Well, initially it happened by accident. I was searching the web in June of '97. Stumbled across a Department of Justice website headline: "What works, what doesn't, what's promising in criminology." And I downloaded all 632 pages over a 3-day period. Read the whole article, and then I said, "Gee, I could really get my teeth into something like this." Because years ago, I took on American Productivity, I got the broadcast industry to come up with a solution on American Productivity. It was very successful. So I knew I could do big things. So it's been so gratifying, because right now I am working with the top criminologists in the entire world. And it just, I have a center at the University of Pennsylvania. I have a center at the University of Cambridge in the UK. I've established the Stockholm Prize, which is referred to as the Nobel Prize of Criminology. It's in the same venue as the Nobel Prize. And every June, I get to have dinner with the Queen of Sweden, because she gives out the prize. So it's exciting.
And this is all about personal satisfaction. There's no profit in that.
No profit at all.
Okay. And you did the same thing you were saying for education?
Well, in education, I was appointed by President Bush to be one of 13 people responsible for research. And I have been responsible for an incredible amount of money that go into research due to the connections I've had with the federal government. So just also the other thing that I'm involved in that I'm really excited is I actually work to improve the way the government spends money.
You're the one.
There's a guy by the name of John Barron who founded the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy in 2001. And his mission was to persuade the federal government to make spending decisions based on rigorous research, like they do in medicine.
Everything for you backs into research.
Backs into research. And this guy started in September 2001. And now the next scene is February of 2002. He's very discouraged because he has applied for funding to 20 foundations and everybody rejects him. Because, this is a ridiculous idea of changing the federal government. Nobody's going to be able to do that. Well, this guy speaks to an organization that I'm one of the founders of called the Campbell Collaboration in February at 11 o'clock in the morning. And I sensed somehow in the way the guy spoke that he may be the second person in my life that was both brilliant and open-minded. So I walked up to him at 12 noon after he's finished talking, grabbed him by the shoulder, and said, "We're having lunch together." I didn't ask him, I said, "We're having lunch." After having lunch with him, he explains how he's been getting all these rejections. So that afternoon, I go back to my office and I sent him a check for $10,000. And just said, I like, no strings attached, just like what I hear. Then what happened, about 2 weeks later, he comes back to me with a plan for $25,000. I said, wait a minute, I just got to know you here. Let me think about it. And then a week later, I get a call from one of the top foundations in the country who had just applied for money. And this person's a woman, a very wonderful woman, who was who I work with in the field of education. She's a program loan, grant maker for this foundation. And she says, our foundation has vetted this guy out. There is no way that he can do what he says he can do.
Huh.
So I just want to do, as a friend, I want you to save you the money, because I know he's hitting you up for 25 grand. I said, thank you very much. Hang up the phone, and I immediately go and write a check out for $25,000.
What's the thinking there? Explain that.
The thinking was, I'm right and they're wrong. I could see there was something in this guy that could do what he says he can do. Now you fast forward today, he has on his advisory board, he has a Nobel laureate, he has the former head of the Kennedy School of Government, he has David Kessler, the ex-head of the FDA, among others, and then he has the research director for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on his board. He is now considered the most influential person in the country for making social change.
Is it having an effect?
It's having a major effect. Mm-hmm. The Office of Management Budget has now issued a directive to the Departments of Education, Crime and Justice, Social Welfare, and Labor that they want to see randomized control for our research, like doing medicine, for every major spending decision they're making. And this is just going to expand throughout the rest of the federal government. The White House is behind it. It's one of the most thrilling things I've ever been involved in.
Interesting. I must back up on what you said. You said this was the second most important person you ever ran into. You said this gentleman was the second most important. Right. Who was the first?
Oh, Dr. Lawrence Sherman, the head of criminology, University of Maryland, who's now the head of my criminology center at the Cambridge University, UK.
Okay. Let's get back to radio for a second, right. Blaise. I do remember, and as you called it beautiful music, I called it elevator music, and it played on elevators. It competed, I guess, with Muzak. Did Muzak exist back then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So, but here you didn't have to pay for it. And what I remember, quite honestly, is you guys gave out radios that you put into doctors' offices and dentists' offices, but it could only get one station, us, right. Yeah. Only DVR. You were talking about the research that goes into it and the 40-year-old woman, and I had read somewhere where you talked about people who were born after the advent of rock and roll, and clearly they have a different sense of music than some of us who actually were around before rock and roll may have. Can you explain that a little bit to us, how that changes from year to year or
I think
decade to decade?
Music evolved. I mean, even in the late 50s and early 60s, and how music evolved, and it continues to evolve. And you actually see how the rock and roll era evolved, and we see people's musical taste evolve yearly. I mean, I got here in '97, and what we played in '97 and what we play today are very different, but we're still the same format. Mm-hmm. We really haven't changed anything. We're still targeting, but musical tastes have changed.
Is it specifically the songs, the music, so that Let me, off the top of my head, I might have played when I was spinning records a musical version of "You Belong to Me" or something like that.
You know, what I think really happened, and I say this quite often to people, is I think it was 2002 that there was a new TV show came out, and it was called American Idol. Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of a resurgence in music in our country. The first winner, Kelly Clarkson, before that show was over, was America's Sweetheart. And the second place winner, Justin Guarini, who was from this area, was America's Sweetheart. And that renewed an interest in music in this country, and artists started coming out from everywhere. And that show just grew and grew and grew. And if you think of the artists that have come out of there that are now superstars, and then you have other shows that have come out like The Voice, the X Factor that came out, and then all these new artists that have come out and new music, and then you have people like, you know, I'm trying to think of some of the artists that are out there right now that we're playing, but that just come out of nowhere. Where did we find some of these artists? And now we're just seeing more music developed, more new artists, more new styles of music, and I think people's palette has broadened as to what they like. And they still like radio, and they still like hearing it on radio. Radio still does break all the new music. That's where people find new music. And
but not on More FM. You're not trying to break music, are you?
No, we don't break music, no. But we play current music.
How current?
This year, stuff that has come out this year, stuff that's come out last year. Yeah. Our music is probably right now, probably the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and current, as we would call it. But all the music is researched. Before it goes on, we make sure that it fits.
And how do you do that?
Well, we do 2 major music tests a year. Mm-hmm. Those are done, well, we're actually doing 3 major music tests a year now. And those are done probably every 3 months, so we don't get stale in any way, shape, or form. Wow. And then we have another company that we deal with where we can test current music that we're playing to make sure there isn't a burnout factor with anything, that we can test every 30 days. So except for December, we are always testing music.
December is devoted to Christmas.
Well, it's a little tougher to test music during that time. People are a little busier to get them to sit down to do some research. So December, we're not doing much research at that time. We're actually dedicating the radio station to Christmas music.
Now, I don't know this because I was never involved in the music end of it other than when I was playing your music. But you would think, or I would think, that there are some people involved in this who go with their gut. That song's going to be a hit, or this is going to be a hit. You guys do it all with research. Is it, do you ever think, well, maybe that's going to work, or do you ever step aside from the research, or that's it, this is the...
Yes, but it's very infrequent that we would do something like that. It's got to be something that maybe has been out for a while, maybe a month or two, and our program director feels very, very comfortable with it, and we can see some initial short testing of it to see that it's doing well.
Wow.
And we will put it on, but it's very far and few in between that we do that.
Okay. Are you playing the artists themselves, or is it still instrumentals, or how does that?
It's artist driven.
It is the song.
100% vocals, no instrumentals at all.
Okay, and that clearly it works for you.
Well, it has been since really 1987.
No, actually,
88.
Yeah.
Started playing all vocals. All
88, February of 88. Yeah.
Wow, and you can narrow it down to February of '88. That's when you made that change, and each change is significant, obviously, but still maintains the audience. I'm sorry.
That was the big one, because we did research. In fact, I went to a radio convention, and I was asked to speak to the beautiful music broadcasters. And to me, speaking at conventions is a waste of time, because what happens, you spend a lot of time prepping, you give your talk, everybody claps, nobody does anything. And I'm an action-oriented person. I want to do things that cause action. So because I was on the board of the NAB, I had to accept this invitation to speak. And I said, aha, I have a way to take advantage of that group without wasting my time. So I made the whole talk about, is there any future in beautiful music? And then I passed a hat at the end of this talk, and 31 stations agreed to help me fund the research. The research came out in December, first week in December on 87. Showed absolutely clear there was no future in beautiful music. As we referred to earlier, people over the age of 40 have a different view because they're in the, under 40, they're in the rock group, over 40 they aren't. And so
This is back in '87.
yeah, right.
Okay.
Right, okay. And so to me, it was a no-brainer. Change. Well, none of the other 31 stations would believe the research. They said, "Well, we probably missed something." I changed, and within 12 months, 95% of all the beautiful music stations in the country changed.
I think what's important here is that Jerry did that research with the help of the other radio stations
Sure.
or groups. But prior to that, Jerry's own research was showing him something, and it probably was starting to tickle up years before that. And he had been looking at it, and he knew something was wrong. And then he had probably more data than everybody else, and he was trying to share it with them with the big study. But he already knew what he needed to do, and the change, of course, was brilliant. It worked.
I got to tell you a quick story on this
Sure.
show, because when we actually made the change, obviously the staff is very nervous about this. I mean, we're changing from beautiful music, which is mostly instrumental, to all vocal. I mean, they were on pins and needles. So at any rate, we started the day, the staff came in around 8:30, and we were flooded with phone calls. Irate people were just madder than hell. They were really mad. And it kept getting worse. So by noontime, I went out and hired a psychologist to meet with the staff the following morning. I mean, that's how bad things were.
To assure the staff.
To assure the staff, right.
Right.
And then this next part of the story I'm going to tell, it brings tears in my eyes every time I recall. Remember Daryl Sifford from the Inquirer? He was a very close friend of mine.
Uh-huh.
At 4 o'clock that day, he calls me and says, "Jerry, I don't know if I can be your friend anymore," and hangs up. I broke down crying. That was unbelievable. I mean, and people, we got thousands of phone calls, hate mail, unbelievable. In fact, for a year, people used to look darts at me when they see me in public. I mean, it's unbelievable. But it was a thing that had to be done.
It's interesting, and I want you to go on, but it's important that people understand, who are slightly younger than we are, that music, you could turn on WDVR or Easy 101 and leave it on in the background, and it was there. Or if you're on an elevator, it was there, or a doctor's office. But you didn't have to pay attention to it. It just was there, and it didn't interfere with anything, because you didn't have to listen to the words or pay any attention to it. You were making a giant change by
Right.
changing that.
And people are passionate about their radio station. People don't think that, but when you do something as dramatic as that, they really get upset.
Did you have any second thoughts about
Never.
it? Never. That the research is enough for you to be certain that you're
Yeah.
going in the right direction. Can you apply that to other things, as you did to?
Well, apply it to criminology, apply it to education, apply it to the federal government.
Yeah.
I mean, it works. Now, the trick is to have two things. One is really good research.
Mm-hmm.
The second is to interpret it, as Blaise says. That's a
You
combination.
got to be able to interpret it.
Yeah. And is that where the gut comes in? Is that where you have the
Well, that's-
instinct to say, "Hey, that's good. That's right." The research.
Well, okay, it's that's where, see, I always make this statement about when somebody learns about something and they learn it intellectually, it doesn't mean anything, because you can always persuade that person to change their mind. But once it goes down into their gut, where they know, they don't have to think about it. They instinctively, they know they're on the right path. When you do that, then you got them. This is where we now have the Office of Management and Budget in Washington. 40% of the Office of Management budget is so committed to rigorous research. It doesn't matter who is president, who's running anything, who's even head of O&B. They are so committed that nothing can change their mind. Okay, and that's the whole thing. Is you got to get down from the intellect to the gut.
You're saying that's 40%.
Yeah.
You got 60% that's still intellectually.
Yeah, well, not even intellectually. We have made no progress with 60% of the Office of Management budget staff. And I have a 15-year time frame. Within the next 15 years, we're going to get everybody on board. But the fact that since we started with the ONB in 2004, by accident, I'm attending a White House conference that I'm one of the funders of on criminology. And a guy sits next to me at the beginning of the meeting, makes some small talking, and he leans over to me and says, I'm taking over the job as the head of research for the Office of Management budget tomorrow. At the end of the meeting, because the meeting was based upon rigorous research, he leans over to me again and says, boy, are we in trouble at ONB, we got lousy research. Would you help me? I mean, here I'm from a small town, Newcastle, Pennsylvania, 50,000 population, and being asked to help the Office of Management budget figure out how they should spend their money. I mean, this is incredible, but this is the type of luck I have. And
I would suggest it's more than luck, but go ahead.
Well, I can sense opportunity, and that's what happened, and that's how I got my foot in the door, Office of Management budget. And a real quick story on that: every month from September 2004 through May of the following year, we had a monthly meeting, and every month it kept getting gutsier and gutsier and gutsier. I mean, I'm on cloud 9. I mean, here, the Office of Management budget, they're listening to me, and they're saying, let's go for it, let's go for it. Let's really get rigorous evidence. And then I walk into the March meeting, and all hell froze over. Everything I said, well, we can't do that, we can't do that, can't do that. And I immediately figured out what was going on. Some key senator must have gotten to OMB and said, back off, because nobody wants to be held accountable. So I got up in front of the group, there's 14 of us, and I says, 20 years from today, the 14 of us are going to look back and say we were responsible for changing the way the federal government spends its money. But we're going to be attacked by everybody in this town because nobody wants to be held accountable. If we just hold fast, we're going to win. The meeting changed on a dime. And in May, ONB issued the gutsiest memo in the history of ONB that said that all federal spending should be based on randomized controlled trial research. And it's taken all these years to get up to 40% actually doing it, but we're making tremendous progress.
Have you thought about running for office?
No, I can't remember her name or face, so I could never run for office.
And that's all that's required.
That's all.
Okay. Talk about another kind of political thing that we think about. I say this when I talk to students, for example. When I got the job at WDVR, I had already applied at perhaps every radio station in Philadelphia, because every radio station had a news department. They were required to have a news department. Right? Everybody had to have one. That has gone by the wayside. There are now 2 news departments in the whole city. And there are where you could only own one AM station, one FM station. Now if somebody came along, they could buy everything except perhaps this station. What do you guys think about that? How do you feel about the direction that the FCC has taken, obviously through Congress, through the new laws?
The deregulation?
Deregulation, of course.
I think it's working perfectly. I think it's great for the industry. It hasn't really affected us as far as news coverage, if that's what you are alluding to. We have a person doing news in the morning. We have a relationship with the traffic service that supplies us anything that we would need. We have a relationship with NBC 10. And there's anything that happens that we think is important, we've gone directly to NBC 10 and we've had coverage from them on just about anything you can think of, from severe weather that has happened, big news stories, terrorist possibilities. And I remember a couple years ago when Sandy came through, it was such a horrible storm that came through in South Jersey and southeastern Pennsylvania that we flipped to, power was out everywhere, people only had handheld radios, we flipped to them and went wall to wall because the coverage was so important. So I think those are, it made us become a little bit, we had to find new ways to be able to make sure that people were informed. But also, I think that it's much easier with your laptops, your iPads, your cell phones, and so forth, to get data from news, updates, stock market quotes, whatever it might be that you need, are more at your fingertips than ever before.
Okay. I didn't mean to, in fact, I was kind of separating what you're doing, because you're an independent station and you can kind of do whatever you want. But I was looking at overall of radio, and just let's look in Philadelphia, where almost every station is owned by one chain or another. They've just announced a switch between CBS and Beasley, right, where they just, here, you take these stations, we'll take that station. And what effect does that have, do you think, on the community? Is it a positive effect? Forget your station for a moment. When you look at radio generally,
I think it is. I think it is. I think that these companies like CBS and Greater Media and Clear Channel do have a commitment to the markets that they're in and try to serve the community that they have. And I don't think in any instance that is really given a product that is inferior. I spent most of my adult life here in Philadelphia, but I did spend a couple years out in the West Coast working for Westinghouse, who was the other company I worked for the other half of my life.
Yeah, I would have worked for you at KYW too. I worked there as well.
Yeah, I was at KYW for a while, and it's interesting when you travel outside of this area how revered Philadelphia is by other broadcasters, and the call letters that are brought up, the people that are brought up. When I was out in San Francisco, people would say, what about that Jerry Lee? Did you know him? That station, what they did there, or KYW, or DAS, or MMR, or OGL. There's a lot of stations in this particular city that outside of this city are revered by other broadcasters because they do so well.
Yeah, just think about how many nominees for the Marconi Awards come out of Philadelphia.
Oh yeah, I mean it's.
Just incredible.
But and when you go through those call letters of those stations, are they as important to the community as they once were, or do they? Is some of that reputation left over from before deregulation?
I don't think so. I think that they're very well run, sound great radio stations. You know, it's interesting. Radio across the country, the average, 92% of the population listens to radio across the country. In Philadelphia, it's about 94% of the population. So we're actually a little bit above in radio listening with the averages across the state, across the country. I happen to think that when you take a look at the formats here in Philadelphia, that they're very well done. And I think as an example, I know for us, we may be one of the most duplicated stations around the country. People listening to us, because everything that we have is out on the web. They can look at our playlist. They can call up on the warm line and listen to the radio station. And I think it's probably the same thing with a lot of these other ones in the marketplace.
Do you worry about that competition? It would seem to be a simple matter to listen to what you're doing and
well,
imitate
you know what?
it.
I'm a great believer in the water rising for everybody. I think that competition makes people great. I think disagreement makes people great. I know that Jerry and I, we have some very spirited discussions about what we need to do from our business standpoint. And I think that great competition makes you great.
But isn't there less competition? I guess that's where I was going with this. If you
so.
only have 2 or 3,
I wish there was.
Yeah, if you only have 2 or 3 corporations that own most of the stations, haven't you eliminated some of that competition?
No, I don't believe that any of those men or women that show up to work at any of those other radio stations will come walk in every day and say to themselves, let me see what I don't have, let me see if I can do less today. I think they all come into work trying to do what I do every day. I walk in there thinking, what can I do to drive ratings and drive revenue? What can we do? Because that's what we all need to do.
Are there any changes you would make, or where's the future? What are we looking at?
To me, the future of radio is the quality of the commercial. And we now know how to produce commercials that are twice as good as the best TV commercial. And that's the whole thing.
I suspect you've done research on that.
Yes, in fact, we are the leaders in the country, in the entire country. I don't care whether you're an ad agency or anything. We've tested over 2,000 commercials here. Radio's not tested. No agency tests radio commercials. And yet, we have tested over 2,000 commercials here. We find that what we've done, we went out and paid big bucks to hire a guy by the name of Dan Hill, the founder of Century Logic. And Century Logic is a company that specializes in advising companies how to get an accurate read on a commercial using the face, called facial coding.
Wow.
And it is incredibly accurate. And as a result, we can predict whether a commercial will work or not work before it goes on the air.
Sounds accurate and scary.
Yeah, it is. It's just it's amazing. And again, this came about by accident. I'm probably the only broadcaster in radio that pays $5,200 a year to subscribe to something called the World Advertising Research Center, WARC, in London. It's a repository for all research in marketing. And I'm in there all the time looking for ideas. And I'm looking for an answer on something, and I stumble across an article written by a guy named Dan Hill, Century Logic. And I read it, and I said, this guy is brilliant. I called him on the phone and said, next time you're in the East Coast, he's in Minneapolis, I want to meet with you. Mm-hmm. Fast forward today, he now considers me one of his two closest friends in the world. And the guy, and Blaise loves him, Blaise works with him. We know more about how advertising works, especially in radio, than anybody. And as a result, this is the future.
You chose to go into radio. You could have probably gone into anything and been quite as successful using this research.
Thank you.
Now, I want to thank you, both of you, for joining us. Blaise Howard, Jerry Lee, fascinating conversation. Thank you all for being with us, and tune again as we present Philadelphia Broadcast Pioneers.